Hello everybody and welcome to our final two lectures on the history of Orthodoxy in the Russian Empire. Over the next two lectures we are going to deal with the Russian Orthodox Church and Orthodoxy in general as it entered into a period of sustained crisis between 1905 and 1917. Now of course it wasn't just Orthodoxy and the Church which were enduring a period of deep and difficult crisis in 1905, in this period, but also the Russian state itself, which went through two revolutions, the final one of which, in February 1917, spelt the end of the Romanov dynasty established at the beginning of the 17th century. Now, for those of you in the audience who've been observant, you may have noticed that we've ended many of our lectures on the threshold of 1905, on the threshold of the First Revolution. And that is because the changes between 1905 and 1917 were so great, were of such a distinctive character from much that went previously, that they deserve their own treatment, which is precisely why we have these two lectures dedicated to them. However, because I've left the lectures until last, I think it would be worth doing a little bit of a recap, a very short recap of what we've covered in the course so far, and the problems which were emerging from Russian Orthodoxy, which became extremely significant in the period between 1905 and 1917-1918. So, firstly there was the issue of church and state. Now, as many of you may remember, the church and the state had an extremely close, indeed symbiotic relationship in Imperial Russia, with the church supporting the state and the state supporting the church. This was in many ways the essence of the synodal arrangement created by Peter the Great. However, Peter the Great's model had never intended to allow the complete subordination of the Synod to Russian secular organs. It had been designed to allow for a degree of autonomy in church affairs. In the 19th century, though, this had become under sustained challenge, largely through the personalities of two particularly interventionist procurators, Baron Nikolai Plotozov and Konstantin Pobedonostsev, both of whom I've mentioned many times before in this course. Through the virtue of their personalities, through the virtue of the almost unlimited support of their Tsars, of their emperors, they had been able to intervene in an unprecedented manner in the purely religious matters of the Russian Holy Synod and in Russian Orthodox religious life in general. This had become increasingly burdensome to the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, who detested the intrusion of laymen, no matter how qualified or how high-ranking, into their own affairs. They had increasingly witnessed as these two procurators in particular had asserted decisions in purely theological and purely church matters. This meant that the nature of the church-state relationship in Imperial Russia was being increasingly questioned from within the church itself by the end of the 19th century, by both bishops and priests. At the same time, this church-state relationship was being questioned by many members of secular society as well. Many people launching criticisms from a liberal and radical point of view of the close link between church and state. Many arguing that close link meant the church was not able to execute its function as a guardian of the Christian faith, as a guardian of Christian morality, as a guardian of the Russian people. This was one crisis which came up particularly strongly between 1905 and 1917. Now we saw the many issues which dogged the Russian priesthood. By the end of the 19th century, many of those problems still remained unresolved. The Russian Orthodox clergy still, for the most part, lacked salaries. They were still poor and still overwhelmingly dependent on their parishioners for support. At the same time, some of the reforms of the state had caused their own problems. I mean, in particular, the reforms in the 1860s, which had opened up the clerical estate to outsiders and had allowed members of the clerical estate to enter into other professions. On the one hand, the opening up of the clerical estate had meant that large numbers of priestly sons in particular, had fled into other professions. This had caused a sort of brain drain effect on the Russian Orthodox clergy, with the best and brightest of its sons going into better paid, more prestigious positions, while the church itself was forced to recruit people with ever lower levels of education. As a consequence, the educational level of the Orthodox clergy overall had fallen by the beginning of the 20th century. Paradoxically, however, the fact that people were no longer forced to remain in the clerical estate had led to the overall professionalization of the pastorate. In other words, the people who remained in the clerical estate, who remained as priests, were generally people far more committed to the idea of their ministry, to the idea of themselves as spiritual fathers tending to their flock. And so what we see by the beginning of the 20th century, is an overall professionalization of the priesthood. A transformation of it from a hereditary caste into a freely chosen profession. And at the same time, yet another problem still remained. The Russian Orthodox clergy was still overwhelmingly subject to the almost absolute control of their bishops. The Russian Orthodox clergy still found their way forward in the church blocked by the prohibition against clergymen, against Orthodox priests becoming bishops. There was a resentment against the monopoly of power wielded by the bishops, and the comparative voicelessness of the clergy in the management and administration of the church. Now, as we've seen in a couple of lectures, religion in society was generally quite strong. The Synod felt quite differently, and many of the bishops felt quite differently. They felt religion was in serious decline in the Russian Empire, a serious decline that required radical measures to revive it. However, as we've seen in various different contexts, Russian Orthodoxy not only remains strong, but indeed seems to be finding new sources of strengths. In comparison to the beginning of the 19th century, for instance, monasticism was flourishing. There were infinitely more monasteries, convents, nuns, and monks by the beginning of the 20th century than there had been a century earlier. Pilgrimage was becoming a mass phenomenon, thanks to new technologies of transportation. Meanwhile, even in the upper echelons of Russian society, Orthodoxy was experiencing something of a revival in terms of interest. The religious philosophies and literature of the Silver Age had provoked a vogue for all things orthodox among the most educated and most prestigious strata of Russian society. And even in the cauldrons of Russia's new industrialized metropolises, Orthodoxy was experiencing some successes. Figures like Ioan of Kronstadt in St. Petersburg, preaching to the working poor, creating charitable institutions, reaching out to the destitute, often in terms that they could understand, marked a significant innovation in how the Russian Orthodox Church was acting in the cities, and certainly created strong followings, not only in the cities, but indeed across the entirety of the empire. As we covered previously, the problem wasn't necessarily a lack of religiosity in the cities, but rather that the Synod was extremely concerned, perhaps overly so, about exercising control over these new forms of religiosity. Their desire and need for control could even reach to an extent that some relatively harmless individuals, if you remember we talked about Ivan Shulikov, could ultimately be expelled from the church simply because they were not subordinated to the Synod's chain of command or bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in the countryside, religion remained much in the same position as it had always possessed. A crucial part of community life, a crucial dispenser of the rituals that gave the peasantry an opportunity to combat malign forces that seemed to beset them from every direction. But even the villages were, of course, changing by the end of the 20th century. Increased literacy rates among the peasants provided a new audience for the Russian Orthodox Church and a new venue for the church to deliver its message. By the end of the 19th century, the church was producing annually hundreds of thousands of copies of cheap newspapers designed for a peasant readership. But the traditional problem in the countryside remained. There was still an overwhelming tension between parishioners on the one hand and their clergy and the church authorities on the other. Parishioners who paid for their churches and often for their priests, for whom those churches were a core part of community life, often wanted to assert their control and their decisions over the forms that this religious life took. This, of course, met the Synod's requirement for strict control, for its own strict control over how this religious life proceeded. Now, I mentioned, generally speaking, this tension did not manifest itself in anti-clericalism, that is to say, a hatred or a dislike or an antipathy towards the clergy as a social group. For many peasants, the priest was still a necessary fixture in their village. The problem was often on an individual level and on the level of religious life, the level where the peasants wanted the priest not to be a servant of the bishop and the synod, but rather their servant, a person whose activities were designed towards catering to their religious life. All of these increasingly vulnerable weaknesses were occurring at a time when the religious choices were increasing in the Russian Empire. Now, certainly the Russian Orthodox Church had launched some successful missionary ventures in the course of the 19th century. But, on the other hand, it had made very little progress when it came to the Old Believers, that traditional enemy of the Orthodox Church, or indeed the various sectarian groups, including newer ones like the Baptists. Indeed, by the end of the 19th century, we have a distinct impression that sectarianism and old belief were growing, gaining converts from the Russian Orthodox Church. And this was because, very essentially, these faiths generally offered parishioners, the laity, a greater role in their own religious lives. They offered a more understandable service. All of this, the Russian Orthodox Church denied them. And this, as we're going to see, became a major argument for the need for reform. The argument was simply, Russian Orthodoxy is losing parishioners to sectarianism and old belief, therefore it needs to reform itself to become more accessible to the majority of the laity. In other words, it needs to solve these problems of the extent of lay control and the extent to which the church would modernize its religious services. So these then were the general set of problems the church had by the year 1900. And already in the last few decades of the 19th century, particularly after the great reforms in the 1860s, these had generated a considerable discourse of church reform in both the secular and the ecclesiastical press. Now, of course, many of these reform programs contained a wide variety of differing and indeed conflicting interpretations about what kind of reform was necessary, to what extent that reform had to be taken, and so on. But we can identify some general points that unified much of the literature of the church reform movement coming up to 1900. There was general agreement, for instance, that Sobornost, this idea of consularity, was needed in the church. In other words, there had to be more council-based decision-making that would allow allow individuals other than the bishops who sat in the synod a voice in the management of the church. Another general demand was for a return to the canons. That is to say, a return to the church law established in the first centuries of Christianity. This reform movement construed itself as a purification of orthodoxy. The abolition of perversions and misinterpretations introduced over history, and a return to the pure bases of the Orthodox Christian faith. And finally, there was a demand for the convocation of a local church council of the Russian Orthodox Church. In other words, a meeting which would have the power to undertake radical reforms of all elements of church and religious life in the empire. And indeed, one was required. The last time a Russian church council, a Sobor, had been called was at the end of the 17th century, in 1689, at the very beginning of the reign of Peter the Great. Many of these reform projects, although not all of them, were also demanding a restoration of the Patriarch. In other words, a restoration of a single head of a church, the system which had been abolished by Peter the Great at the very beginning of the 18th century. And of course, many churchmen and laity focused their ire on the figure of the procurator, someone whom they regarded as being chiefly responsible for the problems that had been introduced into the Russian Orthodox Church. Of course, the fact that Pobedonostsev, the procurator from 1881, was remarkably unpopular among most secular circles in Russian educated society contributed to this demand that either the procurator's powers should be reduced or the position abolished entirely. Now, these were the unifying points of the reform program. But there were a great many questions, a great many differences between the various programs proposed. And there was very little in the way of agreement on the answers to these questions. So, for instance, everyone largely agreed that the Patriarch should be restored. However, there was a great degree of difference when it came to deciding what the powers and the position of the Patriarch should be in the reformed Russian Orthodox Church. Should he be an all-powerful supreme bishop? Or perhaps he should simply be primus inter pares, the first among equals, who chaired church councils that were in reality the true governing body of the institution. And what about the Synod? If you restored the Patriarch, what would happen to it? What powers would it have? What position would it take in this restructured church hierarchy? Who would sit in it? And on what terms would they sit in it? All of these were questions being raised. Then there was the matter of the council. Virtually all reformist churchmen agreed. A council had to be convened. How else were they going to have a discussion about the necessary reforms of a church and the necessary authority to implement those discussions? But there was no agreement on how this council should be constituted. For instance, should the council contain just bishops? Should it contain bishops and priests? Should the laity be allowed to join? And if they were, on what basis? Should they be given a vote in the resolutions? Or should they be there simply as a consultation in order to give their voice, but not be given the power to resolve any key issues? This was a matter of heated debate between various churchmen and secular thinkers. When it came to the return to the canons, now virtually all of a church was demanding a return to the canons by 1905, a return to the pristine sources of Russian church law. But again, this begged several questions. Which canons did they mean precisely? And what about those canons which no longer applied to the context of the modern Russian Empire, and indeed of the modern world in general? Remember, the canons were formulated, most of the canons were formulated before the year 1000. How could these laws be applied to the situation at the beginning of the 20th century? There was general debate, therefore, on which canons needed to be revived and which ones could hopefully be ignored. And then, of course, there was the question of the state. Oh, well, very good. Let's have a reformed Russian Orthodox Church. Let's get rid of the Synod. Let's establish a patriarch. Let's return to the canons. But how are we to formulate a relationship with the Russian state? What role, for instance, should the Tsar play in the church? Should he have any role? Should bishops and priests be part of political life in the Russian Empire? What say, if any, did secular ministries of the state have in the affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church? Again, there was very little agreement on these questions. Now, in terms of the debates that we're going to see in this lecture, and indeed in the next lecture, it is possible to identify four tendencies, four camps, if you like, in the reform debates. Now, I just want to emphasize, these are not parties, particularly they are not political parties in the modern sense. There is no strict discipline over who belongs to which tendency. These are rather vague groupings where often people will change, some people will share points of view in common with one group, but then points of view in common with a different group. But we can at least generally see the sort of evolution of these four kind of points of view on the reform of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, firstly, we have, I would say, liberals/reformists. These were individuals who largely wanted to see a reformed Orthodox Church in a reformed Russian Empire. What they wanted was some kind of enhanced role for the parish clergy and for the laity, either giving them some kind of power in the parishes, or at least giving them mechanisms where they can make their voices heard more clearly in St. Petersburg. They generally articulated for a weaker patriarch, somebody who was not necessarily a supreme head of the church, but was rather the first among equals. Someone who did not possess a great many particular powers, but perhaps was rather more of a symbolic figurehead of a church. They sought the decentralization of authority from the Synod or the central bodies in St. Petersburg down to the dioceses, and indeed perhaps further down to the parishes themselves. Just remember that in the Russian Empire, really, the Synod had most of the power in this structure. The bishops themselves were quite weak in terms of the amount of real decision-making authority that they wielded. The Synod was overwhelmingly in control of the situation in the localities. And liberals, reformists, generally sought for the decentralization of that power, its transfer from the centre to the localities. And they supported as well some degree, some extent of modernization of Russian church services. Perhaps, for instance, they favoured the idea that priests would be allowed to wear secular clothing outside of a church. Perhaps they favoured the idea that when performing the liturgy, the priest would face the crowd of believers rather than the altar. Perhaps they supported the increase of parishioner participation in religious services. And so on, in this kind of vein. Now then we can identify what I've called here the synodals, basically the people who were, at least at this time, the sort of die-hard dedicated friends of Pobedonostsev, and who, like Pobedonostsev, refused or rejected any kind of change. They believed that the Petrine church-state order, that the synodal order, was the best possible kind of order for the church and for the church-state relationship, and therefore refused to countenance any of these reform measures. Now, there were certainly some people among the episcopates, some people among the priesthood, who argued this kind of point of view, but generally speaking, by the beginning of the 20th century, they were a fairly distinct minority. Then there were the conservatives. Now, they also stood for a great deal of reform in the church, but they were much more cautious than the liberals were. They didn't want to see the decentralization of power. They wanted the bishops in particular to retain their authority. They did not want to see power being given to the priesthood or indeed to the laity. And as a consequence, these individuals generally supported the restoration of a strong Russian Orthodox patriarch, someone who had the powers to act as a supreme head of the Russian Orthodox Church. It's probably not surprising that most conservatives were generally bishops, because of course it's a point of view that favours the preservation of their own role, prestige and power within the system. And then finally, probably the smallest group of these four were the radicals. And these were people who demanded the complete abolition of any connection between church and state. To their mind, the two things had to become completely separate. In other words, the Russian state had to become secular, and the Russian church had to have its own absolute and inviolable independent rights, independent religious life. And they furthermore supported the absolute extension of democracy on all levels. In some of their conceptions, for instance, the laity would elect their priests, the priests would elect their bishops, the bishops, together with the rest of the church in council, would elect the patriarch. That was their conception of an entirely new church order, one which reflected the increasing democratization of Russian society as a whole in this period. Now, just to give you very quickly a couple of examples of people propounding reform schemes by the end of the 18th century. So here I'm giving you the example of Father Alexander Ivansov Platonov, who published in the early 1880s an enduringly popular and successful series of articles demanding church reforms. Now, Father Ivansov Platonov, generally speaking, his viewpoint you can sort of term as reformist conservative. So he tended to mingle both ideas from both of these kind of camps. And in his 16 articles, he made demands for a variety of changes to the Russian church order. Now, some of these, you can see the list here I've given you in the slide. But some of these I haven't mentioned, so I will quickly go over them. Now, making the parish a legal, I've said unity here, I mean legal entity, a legal entity. What do I mean by this? In the Russian Empire, the parish was not a legal entity. It was an administrative unit, but not a legal entity like an individual or a corporation or a business. In other words, this meant that the parish could not own its own property. The parish was never able to own its own church or anything in the church. All of this was technically the property of the Synod. And so therefore many reformists argued that making the parish a legal entity, i.e. allowing it to own its own property as a unit, would allow it to exercise greater control of its own religious life, engage parishioners in the management of their church, and therefore lead to a revival of piety and support for the church in the parishes. Ivansov Platonov also argued to end the distinctly non-canonical process of moving bishops around frequently. Pobedonostsev had made use of this tactic quite liberally in order to ensure that politically reliable members of the episcopate were promoted, politically untrustworthy members were demoted, and in order to make sure that that bishops did not remain in a single space where they could develop their own local networks of support, of political and financial support. So they wanted to abolish this. By doing so, they hoped the bishop would become established in a locality, would get to know that locality, and could therefore become a truly local individual who knew the area and was known by people in the area, who would have an in-depth knowledge of the problems and needs of that area. There are also demands from Platonosov to reduce bureaucracy, both in the consistories and for the bishops individually. And finally, again, we see demand for a reduction of the power of the procurator. And you can see why I've termed Ivansov Platonov here as a sort of conservative reformist. He wasn't discussing the abolition of the Synod or even the abolition of the procurator. He certainly was not behind the idea of bishops being elected. But he's behind some demands for decentralization of power, about restoring a degree of authority to the bishops and to the parishes. And of course, like so many others, Ivansov Platonov supported the restoration of the Patriarch. Now, an even more crucial series of articles was released by the church publicist Lev Tikhomirov. Now, Tikhomirov was an interesting individual. In the 1870s, he had been a revolutionary, a populist revolutionary. But following his pardon by the Tsar, he had become a conservative and dedicated monarchist, and also a fervent supporter of the cause of Russian Orthodoxy. His works were immensely popular at the time, and indeed are still being reprinted in various modern editions today. So in 1902, Tikhomirov published a series of articles in one of the country's leading newspapers, Moskovskie Vedomosti. This, by the way, is a sign that church reform was not just a concern of a few churchmen, a few interested laity. No, actually, it was a general matter of interest for a great deal of at least educated society in Russia. Tikhomirov's articles in this leading newspaper garnered a great deal of attention. And when we look at these arguments, we see very much the same kind of thing that Ivansov Platonov had been arguing for a couple of decades earlier. For Tikhomirov, the church was in a desperately weak condition. It was beset by problems, beset by an increase in atheism and amorality in Russian society. It was increasingly challenged by the conditions in the society around it. And one of the reasons, Tikhomirov argued, that the Russian church found itself in this position was that it had never been able to call a genuine, free discussion of its own problems on the basis of which it would be able to launch a comprehensive reform scheme. Therefore, Tikhomirov came down very heavily in support of the immediate convocation of a local church council in Russia. He furthermore argued that restoring the Patriarch would give the Russian Orthodox Church a figurehead, a single voice in which to speak to both the state and to the rest of society. In other words, the restoration of the Patriarchate would provide a new way for the Russian Orthodox Church to engage with secular society. And unsurprisingly, based on all this, he argued for the reduction of the power of the procurator, and, as with many others, a restoration of canonical law as the main and fundamental basis of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, as I mentioned, these articles were immensely popular, spreading in particular among higher government circles. And indeed, copies were eventually handed to Nicholas II himself. And Nicholas II read the articles and was very much at least at this point, persuaded by Tikhomirov's argument. And as we're going to see, this was the impetus for a wave of discussions with Russian churchmen between 1903 and 1907. So now we come then to the moment of crisis. The Russian Orthodox Church in the revolutionary outbreak of 1904 to 1907, really. And the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church was, at this time, Metropolitan Antonii Vadkovskii of St. Petersburg. Now, we've already met him in a variety of different contexts. For those of you who can remember our lecture on Russian Orthodox bishops, I gave the biography of Antonii as an exemplary biography for all the clergy. And perhaps some of you remember the biography of this relatively humble church professor who had lived and studied most of his life at Kazan Ecclesiastical Academy, but because of a great personal tragedy, the loss of his wife and his two children, had become a monk, and subsequently begun a career in the Russian Orthodox episcopate. Now, in 1898, Antonii was appointed, largely at the recommendation of Pobedonostsev, as the new Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, the leading figure in the Russian Orthodox Church and the chairman of the Holy Synod. Pobedonostsev had several reasons for this decision. Antonii was largely regarded as a political quietist, someone who wasn't going to cause much of a fuss. He was also very well regarded in court circles and in high society. He also wielded a great deal of prestige, a very high reputation within the Russian Orthodox Church itself. However, Pobedonostsev completely misunderstood Antonii, because almost from the moment he became the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, Antonii began to agitate, at first privately and then increasingly publicly, in support of church reform. In 1903, having read the articles by Tikhomirov and becoming interested in the cause of church reform, Nicholas II reached out to Antonii, asking for his advice on Tikhomirov's opinions. At the same time, Nicholas forwarded a request to the Committee of Ministers, that is to say, the government cabinet, asking for preparations to discuss both church reform and the extension of religious toleration to the Old Believers and other non-Orthodox communities in the Russian Empire. Now, as we're going to see, toleration and the cause of church reform are deeply interconnected. Largely because of the idea that if non-Orthodox faiths had their rights, their privileges extended, then the Russian Orthodox Church should also gain new privileges and rights in the bargain. If it didn't, how would it compete with these newly empowered non-Orthodox religions? It's going to see this as an important argument made in the Committee of Ministers. So then, of course, there was the context of 1904, 1905. The Russian Empire's war with Japan was going extremely badly. It was a humiliation, basically. The Japanese absolutely wiped the floor with both the Russian army and the Russian fleet, to the great shock, not only of Russia, but of the Western world as a whole. Remember, this is a period of imperialism and colonialism. The Japanese, as an Asian people, are regarded as being inferior. And the fact that they were so able to so comprehensively beat the Russian Empire in 1904, 1905 comes as a tremendous shock. And the Russian Empire and Nicholas II personally lose a great deal of prestige because of this defeat. Meanwhile, the cities were in outcry. The general poor working conditions of the proletariat in the factories of the major urban centres were increasingly leading to demands for improvements to their conditions. Demands that they were willing to voice and articulate through new means of industrial action, particularly strikes. Throughout the course of 1904 and 1905, the Russian Empire's industrial capacity is being paralysed by massive and constant strikes. And of course, that wasn't helping the war effort either. In the countryside, peasants were suffering land hunger. A population increase meant there were more people on the same amount of land, which was creating pressure on the amount of food available. And there was enduring hatred for the payments that the state had charged in the 1860s, when the state had bought the land from the nobility after the abolition of serfdom. This led, in the revolutionary crisis of 1904 to 1905, to massive revolts across the Russian countryside. And in the borderlands of the empire, decades of unsuccessful Russification policies, targeting language and religion in particular, had caused huge discontent, leading to outbursts in 1904 and 1905 of anti-Russian violence and of increasing demands, not for independence at this point, but for at least the expansion of autonomy in these regions. The leading statesman at the time was Sergei von Witte. And von Witte believed that one way in which some of the problems of the empire could be solved was by extending religious toleration. By granting minorities more rights, more religious rights, he believed, it would be possible to calm down the situation in the borderlands, to diffuse the tensions growing in these non-Russian, non-Orthodox areas. He further believed that toleration offered to the old believers would bring them in as a conservative monarchist group who could be relied upon to support the current order and help to diffuse tensions in the empire. In this cause, he was resolutely opposed by Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the old procurator of the Holy Synod, who consistently and unquestioningly rejected demands for the expansion of toleration, especially to the old believers. So you can see that the way forward for both Antonii Vadkovskii and for Sergei von Witte is being blocked by Konstantin Pobedonostsev. He both rejected the expansion of toleration and was a resolute defender of the Petrine system of church-state relations, and who absolutely rejected the idea of a restoration of the patriarchate, the calling of a church council, etc., etc., etc. Well, Antonii and Sergei von Witte, working on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, joined forces. Von Witte invited Metropolitan Antonii to the Committee of Ministers to discuss the new proposals on religious toleration. And Antonii supported him in nearly all of these measures. Pobedonostsev made a fatal mistake in that he refused to attend the meetings of the Committee of Ministers, largely because he was infuriated by the cooperation that Antonii, previously his protege, was now giving to von Witte, his political enemy. Now, why did Antonii Vadkovskii support the extension of toleration to other religious groups? In particular, why did he support giving toleration to the old believers, a group that had consistently rejected the authenticity of the official Russian Orthodox Church? Well, for the reasons I outlined a minute ago. Antonii understood this, that if the religious minorities of the Russian Empire were given more autonomy, were given more privileges, then this was an argument that could be used to support the cause of church reform. Antonii would be able to turn around and say, how can you give more privileges, more freedoms, more autonomy to non-Orthodox faiths, while you leave the Russian Orthodox Church bound, restricted, unable to reform, unable to act, unable to compete on its own terms? In other words, Antonii was taking a risk, making a gamble. By giving more toleration, by supporting toleration to non-Orthodox faiths, he believed that he would have a tool and a measure to gain concessions from the state for the Russian Orthodox Church. And by the end of 1904, Nicholas II had agreed to the measures jointly prepared in the Committee of Ministers by von Witte and by Metropolitan Antonii. He had, in other words, agreed to the extension of religious toleration to Russia's religious minorities. However, this was only the first round in the political game between von Witte and Metropolitan Antonii on the one hand, and Pobedonostsev on the other. Antonii was both backed and spurred forward by reformist elements in the Russian Orthodox clergy, particularly a group of 32 St. Petersburg priests who, in February 1905, wrote Antoni a detailed memorandum demanding reforms to the synodal Russian Orthodox Church. The priests urged that reform was necessary if Russian Orthodoxy was to retain the loyalty of the Russian people. Furthermore, they insisted there had to be a decentralization of power in the church. For instance, they stipulated the laity and clergy had to have voting roles in the council when one was convened. If the laity did not, they warned, then there was the risk of mass apostasy to the old believers, who, under the new reformed toleration legislation, would possess greater freedom and autonomy than the Russian Orthodox Church, they argued. So in other words, these individuals generally were on the liberal side in that typology I discussed earlier. They were people who were demanding the decentralization of power from the Synod and its redistribution, not just to the bishops, but to the parishes and to the clergy, the parish clergy. Antoni not only supports them in private, but urges them to go public with their demands. And indeed, the letter of the 32 priests is published very shortly after it had been sent, causing a great stir and controversy, not only in church circles, but also in wider educated society. Now, Witte, by this point, is beginning to tremble, waver a little bit. He's not sure. By February, March 1905, the revolutionary situation in Russia has gotten far, far worse than it had been by the end of 1904. And von Witte is deeply afraid that this is simply not the right time to launch a relatively radical reform of Russian Orthodoxy's position. This was the moment when Metropolitan Antonii really stood up. He stood forward, and at this point, when his ally was trembling, said that they had to go forward. With ever greater stridency, he demanded a series of fundamental reforms to the condition of Russian Orthodoxy. He demanded autonomy of the church from the mechanisms of state bureaucracy that had so tied down bishops and priests in the course of their duties. He demanded the recognition of the parish as a legal entity. In other words, as a body that could own its own property and dispose of its own property. A mechanism for revitalizing parishioner interest and control over their religious lives. And finally, he demanded the restoration of the patriarchate, to be a figure who could represent the church in the highest echelons of a state and in society as well. Antoni's stridency in the Committee of Ministers, his fervent belief in his cause, convinced von Witte to continue in the reform program. And he put his name to this in a detailed memorandum written to the Tsar in February and published at the end of 28th of March, where von Witte stated categorically that reform of the Orthodox Church along the outlines provided by Metropolitan Antonii was fundamentally necessary. Nicholas, ever an indecisive, cautious man, still needed some further convincing, despite the strident arguments made by Vadkovskii and von Witte in the von Witte memorandum. And so both men met with the Tsar throughout February and March 1905 to persuade him that this was the right course of action, that a church council was absolutely necessary. And so finally Nicholas II, besieged by the revolutionary violence emerging in Russian society, agreed to the convocation of a Russian Orthodox Council, Church Council. Pobedonostsev wasn't done, however. He certainly made a fundamental strategic error in the end of 1904 when he had not attended the Committee of Ministers meetings where Antonii and von Witte had forged their alliance. But now he sought to make up lost ground. He tried now to change Nicholas II's mind, never a very difficult prospect. And in order to do so, he wrote a detailed document rejecting all strands of church reformist thought currently circulating in ecclesiastical and secular circles. Now, Nicholas II was a kind of person who would basically always agree with the last person he talked to. And indeed, having previously given his agreement to a church council, now changed his mind, it seemed, by taking away the discussions of church reforms from the Committee of Ministers, in other words, the committee controlled by von Witte, and giving the discussions to the Synod. In other words, an arena that Pobedonostsev himself controlled. So it seemed like von Witte and Metropolitan Antonii had been outwitted by Pobedonostsev, who had persuaded the Tsar to essentially turn over the discussions for church reform to a body that he was sure would reject them. However, von Witte was not the kind of person to take this lying down, and he responded more or less immediately to Pobedonostev's points. With the help of various reformist church canon lawyers, von Witte categorically, point by point, tore down Pobedonostev's arguments. And it did not help Pobedonostsev that his document had been written with the help of a largely untrained and very, very young church academic who later got a reputation for plagiarism and academic dishonesty. Von Witte pointed this out to the Tsar, that Pobedonostev's research and sources were deeply flawed. And the result was that Nicholas changed his mind once more. Infuriated that Pobedonostsev had made him look foolish by getting him to agree to a almost fundamentally incorrect interpretation of the current church order, Nicholas II for discussion to the Committee of Ministers. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Nicholas II stated that the decisions so far made by the Council of Ministers would be printed, therefore essentially making public the plans that were already in progress, making it that much harder for the Russian government to move away from them. Now, as I just mentioned, Pobedonov's victory in all this seemed to have been that the discussion of church reform was taken away from the Committee of Ministers, the body controlled by von Witte, and given to the Synod, a body largely dominated by Pobedonostsev and his chancellery. But Pobedonostsev made another mistake. He took it for granted that the Synod would conform to his viewpoint, and so didn't bother to turn up on the sessions between the 18th and 22nd of March, when the Synod came to discuss church reforms. This was a huge mistake, because it gave the Synod and its bishops the ability to discuss church reforms freely, and discuss them freely they did. Remarkably, the Synod actually argued for its own abolition, for the restoration of the Patriarchate, and for the decentralization of its authority to groups of dioceses called metropolias. These results, along with the records from the Committee of Ministers, were published, engendering a widespread discussion of church reform throughout both the church and educated society. And once again, at the end of March, Nicholas II commits himself to calling a church council in order to make widespread changes to the order of the Russian Orthodox Church. And as we know from previous lectures, on the 17th of April 1905, Nicholas does indeed publish the Edict of Religious Toleration, the fundamental part, which was a fundamental part of Metropolitan Antonii's argument for why the Russian Orthodox Church needed greater autonomy, needed greater freedom. Pobedonostsev, however, had one last card left to play. Antoni Vadkovskii had turned against him. The Synod had turned against him. But he still hoped that he had enough supporters in the episcopate who would either support his point of view or would slow down the process of reform to such an extent that it never happened. In July 1905, therefore, while Sergei von Witte was away in America negotiating a peace treaty with the Japanese, Pobedonostsev dispatched a request to all of the dioceses of the Russian Empire, asking for their opinions and views on the proposed church reform. Pobedonost's hope was basically to rally his supporters in the episcopate, but he also believed that it would take such a long time for these slow, lethargic consistories to respond to the request for information, but the situation would have radically changed by the time the information arrived. However, once again, Pobedonostsev was proved wrong. The reports all came back in a relatively timely manner by November 1905. Of course, sort of 5 months seems a long time, but one should remember some of these documents were tens and tens of pages long, consisted of thorough research into this question. And compared to the legendarily inefficient nature of the consistories, 5 months was indeed a rapid turnaround period. Not only had there been a quick response to Pobedonossev's demands for church reforms, but the support that he presumed existed in the episcopate did not emerge. In fact, virtually all of the reports sent to Pobedonostsev at the end of 1905 rallied around some kind of church reform. Of course, they didn't necessarily agree with what church reform was required, but all of them demanded reform as a matter of course. And that basically finished Pobedonostsev. The cause he had supported as a procurator, that is the absolute defense of the Petrine system of church and state and the Petrine synodal order, had been defeated. As a consequence, Pobedonostsev himself resigned at the end of 1905, bringing an end to over 2 decades of his position as the Oper procurator. Now then, there was the question of what to do next. Well, Nicholas had promised a council. The Synod had largely moved in favour of church reform. All of the dioceses of the Russian Empire had given their voice to church reform. What should happen now? Well, the first step, of course, was to convene the local council of the Russian Orthodox Church, the first one in over 200 years. But necessarily, preparations had to be undertaken for this to occur. And so the pre-consular commission met in 1906 to basically hammer out issues that the church would discuss, the basic positions that the church would be asked as a collective to vote on. And of course, they needed to resolve several other matters. They needed to resolve, for instance, who would be invited to the council. Just bishops, bishops and clergy, bishops and laymen, who would have voting rights in the council. And other matters. Now, I've given you the various sort of details here about the sort of structure of the commission, the number of members in the commission. What I just want to say here as a general summary of this year's worth of activity spent on planning reform is it truly reveals, I think, for the first time and very, very publicly, just how much division there is within the Russian Orthodox Church. I've said this before in this lecture, and I will no doubt say it again, but here it is for emphasis. Virtually most people in the church at this point are in favour of some kind of reform. But what kind of reform? And to what extent? Here there were fundamental divisions between various groups and individuals. Concerns that could not simply be papered over in the course of a year-long discussion. And I think because the minutes of the commission were published, it made truly obvious to Russian society for the first time just how divided and lacking a single voice the Russian Orthodox Church was at this point. So I'm going to just discuss a few here, just very quickly here. A couple of issues, for instance, that the pre-consular commission discussed in 1906. So as I mentioned, there was the question of who would get to participate in the forthcoming local council of the Russian Orthodox Church. Here we see there was some division about whether laity or clergy should have voting rights, or whether they should be allowed in at all. And of course, the reason why this is important is because it reflects views on who made up the church, which group of people was considered an important part of the church, who made up the most important community within the church. Granting the laity the right to be at the council, and indeed the right to vote in the council, was a mark of someone who believed the laity needed to be brought into the consultations of a church. Someone who believed that the laity deserved a voice in the church. People who believed that the church's basic function was to serve the people of Christ. Then there was discussion about various ideas of decentralization. How to take powers away from the overly centralized synod in St. Petersburg and distribute them to the dioceses and maybe even to parishes. One of the fundamentally popular ideas was this notion of metropolias, i.e. a group of dioceses who would inherit, whose leader, a metropolitan, would inherit some of the powers from the synod. Now, of course, for many, the most fundamental issue was the restoration of the Patriarchate. At least this was the most symbolic issue discussed in the pre-consular commission. And there emerged basically three camps on this issue. So firstly, there was the idea that the Patriarch would rule through a synod. In other words, there would be a permanently sitting synod under the Patriarch through which he would issue instructions to the rest of the church. Second option was that there would be an all-powerful Patriarch, someone who concentrated authority in his hands and did not necessarily govern through a mediating institution like the Synod. And the third option was that the bishop would essentially be a chair of regularly convened local church councils. In other words, he would have to share his authority with the rest of the Russian Orthodox Church, who would make major decisions together in a council, convened every few years. Now, it should go without saying that the vast majority of the Commission voted for restoration of the Patriarchate. But there was no clear agreement on this idea of what powers the Patriarch should have, what position he should take within the Church. This remained a matter of deep contention. Indeed, it remained so until 1917. Then there was the fundamental issue of church and state. Now, the Commission argued and resolved that the Tsar could have maintained some duties, the duties that had historically belonged to the Tsar in the 17th century and earlier, with regards to the church. He could, for instance, order the convention of a church council and would be in charge of opening and closing the church council. However, he would not participate or preside in the discussions and resolutions of the council. In other words, Nicholas, or the Tsar, would take on a largely ceremonial role within the operation of the church and its reform. They also resolved for changes to the position of the procurator. And they basically, the council, the commission, basically resolved that he would become, basically a lawyer for the church. He'd become a legal assistant who would advise them on the laws of the state in a given matter. For instance, if there's a discussion about building a parish church, for instance, he would be someone who would consult various government ministries and provide the Synod with legal advice about how to acquire property, legal fees, etc., etc. So in other words, he would no longer be even, he would be reduced very much to this sort of almost, even beyond the original conception of Peter the Great. He wouldn't be a link between the church and the state anymore, but simply someone who advised the church on legal matters when it was making its decisions. Now, various other issues were also resolved by the church council. There was the desire to decentralize authority. Again, and it was argued one way to do this would be simply to create more bishops. If you created more bishops and more dioceses, this would mean that it would be the flocks of a diocese would become smaller, allowing for bishops to gain for the business of individual bishops to lessen, and for them to gain a greater degree of interaction with the localities entrusted to their spiritual care. A lot of the issues that had been previously assigned to the Synod would be reassigned to the bishops. So, for instance, divorces would now be decided by the bishop. The establishment of monasteries and convents would be decided by the bishop and not the Synod. And they would manage missionary affairs rather than the Synod. This commission resolved fundamentally that parishes would become full legal persons with the right to dispose of their property and their own finances. As I've discussed earlier, parish would cease to be a simply administrative unit commanded by and owned by the Synod, but would become its own entity, capable of managing to a large extent its own parish economy. And finally, there was some evident ideas that a new approach to the old believers had to be taken, an approach which would allow which would break out of this pattern of persecution and missionary efforts that the church had usually maintained against the old believers. A letter was written by the Pre-Consular Commission to the leader of the Bela Kunitsaya old believer hierarchy, urging for a mutual reconciliation, mutual reunification. So in other words, the Orthodox Church seemed to be moving away from its historical position of either persecuting old belief out of existence or sending missionaries against them, and was now asking for, apparently, negotiations with the old believers about the terms on which the unification could be accomplished. So there were some bases for discussion at the supposedly forthcoming local church council. For all of the divisions, the Pre-Consular Commission had resolved some issues, and therefore created a program for the future Sabor, the future local church council. However, at this point, the Tsar Nicholas II broke his word that he had previously given to Sergei von Witte, who by this point had resigned and been replaced by Pyotr Stolypin, and Metropolitan Antonii Vadkovskii. When the Pre-Consular Commission requested the convocation of the council, Nicholas II scrawled on the bottom, very briefly and very succinctly, "A council will not be called at the present moment." So in other words, the efforts launched by von Witte and Antonii Vadkovskii at the end of 1904 had all been in vain. Nicholas II was not going to call a council. Now, why did Nicholas change his mind? Beyond the fact that he seemed to always change his mind about pretty much everything. Well, one reason, perhaps the main reason, was that by the time the Pre-Consular Commission had finished its discussions, it was 1907. The disorders from the revolutionary period had largely been quelled, both in the cities and in the countryside. The crisis, in other words, that had pushed Nicholas II to even consider church reform had now come to a conclusion. And given that he was in a much stronger position, Nicholas II saw no reason to give concessions on this particular matter. But the problem with Nicholas' decision was it was the worst of both worlds. For you see, Nicholas II did not either accept or reject the idea of a church council being convened. What he said was a church council will not be convened at the present moment. In other words, well, maybe there'll be one in the future. And this was the worst possible decision. On the one hand, the church did not gain a council, but on the other hand, it was in constant expectation that one might be coming in the very near future, that Nicholas II might, for some reason or another, change his mind or fulfill his promise. And this meant, throughout the rest of the period, the Synod is extremely reluctant to take any serious major decisions in the matter of changing church life. Because if a council is called, then the decisions made by the Synod and the changes made by the Synod could be very simply easily abolished by the local church council, which was superior in terms of hierarchical status to the Synod. Just to repeat, in case that's rather complicated, the Synod did not want to make changes in case a church council was called, since the church council could very easily decide to simply abolish the decisions that the Synod had made. In other words, the Synod could not operate in the absence of a council as a potential motor for church reforms. And all because Nicholas was essentially being typically indecisive, neither deciding on one thing nor the other, and ending up with the worst possible outcome. Now, there were occasional sparks to the idea, once again igniting the hope that council would be coming very soon, between 1912 and 1914. Another commission met, this time a much smaller one, a much less public one, once more to submit a reform plan. for how to go forward. And it came to very, very similar decisions as the 1906 Commission had done. But once again, no action was taken on this. And by the time this new commission had finished its deliberations, the First World War had already broken out, and nobody was thinking about church reform anymore. Now, the fallout from Nicholas II's refusal to call a council was immense for both the Synod and for Antonii Vadkovskii. Firstly, Nicholas II was eager to make sure that the events of early 1905 did not repeat themselves. That basically the Synod would not once again take the initiative and launch or support a campaign for radical church reforms. And so he made sure to dismiss the allies of Vadkovskii in the Synod and replace them with conservative and reactionary supporters of the synodal order. Antonii Vadkovskii himself now became increasingly unpopular and isolated in the episcopate. His gamble to give non-Orthodox minorities, particularly the old believers, greater privileges and a greater extent of toleration had, in return for the opportunity to reform the church, had failed. The church was still in the same position, whereas its enemies, its confessional enemies, had been empowered by Antonii's decision. The result was Antonii was increasingly isolated, not only within the Synod, but within the episcopate itself. He was increasingly pushed from church political life. It was widely known that Nicholas II very much wanted to dismiss Antonii Vadkovskii. However, he was persuaded by many of the bishops in the Orthodox Church not to do this. However much they deplored Antonii's decisions and their consequences, they still respected Antonii's reputation and him as an individual. And no doubt they also wanted to avoid the controversy that would be caused by the dismissal of the leading hierarch of the Russian Empire, an event which had never previously occurred in the imperial period. So Antonii Vadkovskii therefore held his position by a thread and basically led a ghost life, while conservatives and reactionaries increasingly took over the direction the church was going in. One of the main manifestations of this new direction was the overwhelming support in the church, active support in the church for the union of the Russian nation. An extreme right-wing body, well known for its xenophobia, its extreme Russian nationalism, and its violent anti-Semitism. Now, while many members of the Russian Church joined the union of the Russian nation, including two of the most senior bishops in the church, the Metropolitans of Moscow and Kiev, Antonii was able to use what little left there was of his political authority to prevent the Synod from actively declaring its support for the union. In other words, As a consequence of Nicholas's decision not to call a church council, Antonii's career essentially found itself at its end, and the Russian Orthodox Synod moved ever more rightwards towards the forces of reaction and highly questionable ideologies. But what about others who had been involved in this attempt to gain a new position for the Russian Orthodox Church? Well, remember the letter of the 32 St. Petersburg Priests. This became the basis, the fundamental grouping of a new church political organization, the so-called Union for Church Renovation, established in October 1905. And the idea of the Union for Church Renovation was to present reformist and in some cases radical views on church reform in Russian politics and in Russian society. And indeed, the program that they came to was distinctively radical in terms of its outlook on the church and reforms. So, for instance, many of their members were demanding the separation of church and state, abandoning Old Church Slavonic in the liturgy and replacing it with modern Russian, abandoning the Julian calendar, which the Russian Orthodox Church had used since the beginning of the 18th century, and replacing it with the Gregorian calendar, that is to say, the calendar used throughout much of the rest of the Western world at this point. They argued in particular for the right for married priests to become bishops. In other words, being a bishop would no longer be the monopoly of monks. And in their political views, in their purely secular political views, some of the members went even further than this, being radical socialists and having associations with some radical socialist parties in the new constitutional politics that had emerged after 1905. Now, the two most prominent members of this group were Father Grigorii Petrov, a priest, and Abbot Archimandrite Mikhail Semyonov, both of whom were prominent figures in the St. Petersburg Ecclesiastical Academy, and indeed had been pupils of Antoni Vadkovskii. Several of their members were elected to the Duma, the new parliament in the post-1905 constitutional Russian state. However, unsurprisingly, there were increasing clashes between this radical group of organized reformist and radical clergy and the increasingly reactionary Holy Synod. And this clash had its inevitable consequences. By 1908, the Union of Church Renovation had been essentially disbanded. The priests it had put into the Duma had in fact been defrocked because they had supported not any of the conservative or right-wing parties, but because they had supported the parties of the left, especially the Labour Party. Petrov, after being imprisoned in a monastery for his support of the Labour Party, was eventually forced to renounce his position as an Orthodox priest and was defrocked. were thrown out of the church. Archimandrite Mikhail Semyonov, increasingly disillusioned by the failure of the reform movement and by the Synod's turn to the right, decided to abandon the Russian Orthodox Church and joined the old believer Belaya Knitsa hierarchy. Now, it should be noted that Archimandrite Mikhail was well regarded in Russian society. He was an eloquent speaker, an eloquent writer, who had a great deal of appeal and popularity in many circles in Russian society. And so his decision to abandon the church for the old believer episcopal hierarchy caused a great deal of scandal. A few others who had supported the cause of reform found themselves suffering from punishments. Bishop Andrei Utomsky, for instance, at this point a suffragan bishop in the Diocese of Kazan, had vocally supported church reform in many secular and ecclesiastical newspapers and in many speeches between 1905 and 1910. He had, for instance, very publicly denounced Rasputin and supported the expansion of freedom of conscience. For these crimes, Andrei was dismissed from his position in Kazan and sent to become the bishop of an extremely obscure and remote diocese in the capital of Abkhazia, in the northern Caucasus. Andrei claimed that he only found out about the change in his position from the local newspapers. In other words, no one had bothered to even inform him. And it should be mentioned that, of course, one of the reasons for this was Andrei was very publicly a supporter and protege of Antoni Vadkovskii, at least in some senses. Meanwhile, in the ecclesiastical academies, reform-minded professors found themselves removed from their positions, and those that remain were subjected to an increased amount of censorship of what they published on questions of reform and changes to the church. So that really brings us to the end of the narrative of the political shift between 1904 and 1911, 1912. The attempt by Antoni Vadkovskii and Sergei von Witte to pressure Nicholas II into giving a church council. Nicholas II's initial decision to grant that council and the resignation of Pobedonostsev as a result of that, the discussions of a church reform, Nicholas II's decision not to call a council, and the shift of the Synod and the church in general to the right into reaction, the rejection of reform politics in the church, and the dismissal of bishops, priests, and professors who stood behind the cause of reform in the church. However, there are some other elements in this period we should discuss. And one of them was the position and the role of the church in the emerging new politics of Russia. So, outside of the church, the major concession that Nicholas II had been forced to make in October 1905 was to essentially transform Russia from an absolutist state into a constitutional monarchy. And this he did with the creation of the Duma. However, even when Nicholas created the Duma, he was sure not to sacrifice his right to his absolute power. He never stipulated that the creation of a Duma meant that he was still not an absolute monarch. And throughout the period between 1905 and 1917, Nicholas II very thoroughly demonstrated his dislike and disdain for the Duma and for constitutional politics in particular. Now, I don't want to go too much into this in too much detail in the course of this lecture, but basically Nicholas II, for instance, and his government continually limits the franchise, that is to say, the people who can vote. He does it by introducing ever stricter and stricter property qualifications, for instance. In other words, you had to own a certain amount of property to vote in the Duma, and the amount of that property increased as Nicholas II tried to ensure that the Duma would only represent the conservative interests of aristocrats, capitalist industrialists, and other reliably conservative voices. And each time any of the Dumas disobeyed or went against Nicholas II's wishes, he was very quick to prorogue, in other words, to suspend the session of a Duma and call a new election. This was, so for instance, the first Duma, the most radical Duma, because it was too liberal, was very quickly suspended by Nicholas II in the hopes that a more limited election would produce a more conservative Duma. And indeed, well, in the case of the hopes weren't really met in the second Duma. There were still representatives of extremely radical left-wing groups in the Duma, and so again, Nicholas II suspended it. Again, called an election with a restricted franchise, ever attempting to make sure that the Duma simply became a puppet of conservative interests that would back the government of Nicholas II. Now, the Church, despite some debate about whether it should take on an actively political role in this new constitutional system, did start to send some of its deputies from the priesthood to the Duma. Indeed, initially there was some priests were even encouraged, because it was widely expected that the priests would rally their parishioners behind conservative political parties, and any priests who were elected would necessarily embody a conservative point of view. Well, the fact of the matter is that it was actually quite, that really wasn't the case. In fact, in the first few Dumas, many of the priests elected to the Duma represented radical left-wing or liberal parties, with only some of them joining the more conservative or more moderate groups in the Duma. The Church also received some representation in the State Council. That was the second chamber of this new Russian parliamentary system. The State Chamber was entirely controlled by Nicholas II. He made all of the appointments to positions. And bishops and priests gained some seats in the State Council, allowing them to have an influence on Russian politics. So basically the point I'm trying to make is that there was a degree of church engagement in the new parliamentary politics. They were expected to rally their parishioners in elections, and some of them were were sent or chosen to play a role in these constitutional assemblies themselves. although this did not entirely go to plan as far as the state, as far as Nicholas II was concerned, because some of these priests who were elected actively supported left-wing parties. Now, for the Church, one of the major political issues of the time, of this period between 1905 and 1914, was the question of the legal position of non-Orthodox groups in the Russian Empire. Now let's go back. On the 17th of April 1905, Nicholas II had issued the Edict of Toleration, expanding the rights of all non-Orthodox groups, so the privileges of all non-Orthodox groups, but the Old Believers in particular. Then in October 1905, in the October Manifesto, Nicholas II declared freedom of conscience to each individual citizen of the Russian Empire. Now the difference was that the Edict of Toleration was a piece of legislation and was fairly rapidly implemented. The October Manifesto, on the other hand, was a promise. It was not an already implemented piece of legislation, and therefore it needed to be realized. It needed various legal projects now to go through the Duma and the State Council in order to secure further rights for religious minorities and to establish the principle of freedom of conscience in the Russian legal code. However, even though it was backed by the government of the Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, most of these projects failed to get through the Duma or the State Council. Now, there are several reasons for this. I believe I've mentioned some of them in the previous lectures, but here they are again. Firstly, there was the fact that Stolypin's own political star began to sink quite rapidly as Nicholas II began to reject even the relatively conservative reforms that Stolypin proposed, ones aimed at securing the basis of the monarchy, while also making a few minor concessions in some areas. Stolypin, by the sort of end of his life, the end of his political career, had become extremely unpopular with Nicholas II and so had lost much of his political clout. But one of the other reasons this project failed was because the Church mobilized its political support in the State Council, mobilized its support in court circles around Nicholas II to oppose the passage of any of these new projects aimed at implementing the principle of freedom of conscience. A major figure here was the new procurator, Pyotr Izvolsky. Izvolsky engaged in a long battle with Stolypin to try and defeat the Stolypin's legislative program to offer greater rights, greater freedoms to members of non-Orthodox confessions. And the result of the Church of Izvolsky's intervention and the Church's mobilization of its political supporters was the fact that despite Stolypin's relatively firm support, this legislation in favor of toleration, of freedom of conscience, was defeated, was thrown out. This is why I've told you in earlier lectures, freedom of conscience was never really realized in the Russian Imperial Law Code. Even though Nicholas II had promised it in the October Manifesto, thanks to the Church and various other parties, it never was passed into law in the last decade of the empire's existence. Now, for the final part of our lecture, we have to look at, really, I suppose, what we call the church in revolution. But basically the signs that the authority of the Synod is beginning to collapse throughout the Russian Empire. First, we can discuss the role of priests, and at least in one case of a bishop, in favour of the revolution itself. Now, there was only one bishop who actively supported the revolutionary cause in 1904 and 1905, Antonin Granovsky. And basically Antonin's support took the form of removing the name of Nicholas II in the liturgy, in the litany of thanks that accompanied the liturgy, and also because he preached against the police services. And for this, Antonin was, unsurprisingly, removed from his position and sent to a monastery, although that certainly was not the end of his long and eventful career. 247 clergymen throughout the Russian Empire, a very small number compared to the total, were in some way or the other arrested or charged for revolutionary crimes in this period. But the real sites for the manifestation of social radicalism and opposition to the imperial order in the church were the seminaries. Now, we've long discussed how bad conditions were in the seminaries. Dirty, overcrowded, cold in winter, full of extremely harsh, violent punishments. They were certainly not ideal environments to learn. And indeed, seminarians, a relatively educated group of young men, had been long protesting against the conditions in the seminaries. And unsurprisingly, these environments proved fertile soil for the propaganda of Russian revolutionaries. As a result, in 1904, 1905, the seminaries saw widespread outbreaks of violence and opposition to both the established order in both church and state. 43 seminaries had to be closed in 1905 by November 1905 as a result of widespread and long-lasting rioting by their students. And the violence didn't just stop with rioting. In Moscow and Tomsk, seminary students were caught throwing bombs on the streets in support of the revolutionaries. In Kharkov, rather horrifically, seminary students threw acid into the face of a rector. In other words, in the midst of revolutionary violence, as a consequence of a long-term structural problem with the church's educational system, the Synod had definitively lost control over a part of its institution, the seminaries. An important part of its institution, it should be said. Of course, order was re-established, and there were some attempts after this to reform conditions in the seminaries. But nonetheless, the point had been made. The church, during the revolution, had essentially lost control of one of the most fundamental rung of its educational system, the rung in charge of educating future priests. Furthermore, there was very clearly violence emerging in the non-Russian borderlands, caused as a result of intense dislike for Russification measures. Now, Georgia was an Orthodox country. It had been long before Russia was baptized. But at the beginning of the 19th century, the Georgian Orthodox Church had been amalgamated into the Russian Orthodox Church following the annexation of Georgia by the Russian Empire. And by the end of the 19th century, there had been many aggressive attempts to Russify Georgian religious life, especially in the sphere of church education. And the Russian Orthodox Church had generally been opposed to appointing Georgian churchmen, for instance, to be bishops in Georgia. All of this led to a surge in violent opposition to the Synod in the Georgian Orthodox Church, particularly in the seminary in particular. The Synod was advised by the Georgian Orthodox Church, members of the Georgian Orthodox Church, to send a Georgian hierarch to be the Exarch of Georgia, that is the highest ranking Georgian bishop. But differing, being indecisive, the Synod ultimately made the wrong choice and decided to send a rather reactionary Russian Orthodox churchman, Nikon Sofisky, in 1906. Now, Nikon was so afraid of his own personal safety that he actually took a bulletproof coat with him on taking up his new position in Georgia. And as it turns out, he was very right to be afraid, because on the 28th of May 1908, he was shot dead on the steps of the Orthodox consistory in Tbilisi. What this is representative of is a process which the American historian Paul Worth has called the ethnic fragmentation of Orthodoxy at the beginning of the 20th century. The Russian Orthodox Church, as part of the apparatus of the Imperial Russian state in the borderland provinces, was beginning to disintegrate as the state's purchase on minority peoples itself came under increasing question and challenge. The Orthodox Church, too, began to lose its authority. And of course, the murder of Exarch Nikon was an alarming sign that violence was increasingly being seen as a legitimate form of political expression. Now, problems in the church, within church politics, did not simply come from those on the left, those who joined the revolution. There were also problems from the extreme right. Even though the Synod had increasingly begun to move in this direction. And we see the problems that were coming from the extreme right in the figure of Iliodor Trufanov, the so-called mad monk. A young, charismatic, well-educated and intelligent figure. Iliodor had his career in Tsaritsyn, where he was appointed to be an abbot of a local monastery. Tsaritsyn was still, today it's called Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad after the revolution, and today is known as Volgograd. And while there, he joined the anti-Semitic right-wing Union of the Russian People. And this reflected his own views very well. Extraordinarily anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, anti-liberal, anti-cosmopolitan, anti-elite. Iliodor embodied a populist, extreme right-wing reaction against the revolutionary disorders of 1905. Iliodor repeatedly flouted and disobeyed not only the orders of the Synod, but even of the secular government. And he was able to do so because he possessed key supporters in the government and in the Synod who protected him from the adverse consequences of his actions. And indeed, he was causing a lot of adverse consequences. In Tsaritsyn, he was notorious for getting involved in fights, both physical and legal. In 1 year alone, 1911, Iliodor launched 53 lawsuits against various figures in the local society of Tsaritsyn, most of them members of the city's governing council and its merchant elite. The very people, in other words, who Iliodor was usually busy insulting in his well-attended diatribes against the Jews, against cosmopolitans, against liberals, and against elites. He was also, as I mentioned, frequently involved in fights. The first one, on the 10th of August 1908, caused such a stir that the Synod ordered his removal from Tsaritsyn and told him to go to Minsk. Iliodor, however, did nothing. Sat in Tsaritsyn for months before he finally went to St. Petersburg. And basically through his supporters in the imperial family, he was certainly known to the Empress Alexandra, but also in church circles, he was able to have this sentence repealed. When he got back to Tsaritsyn after his trip, his socializing trip to the capital, he began to construct an enormous monastery complex built in the most tasteless forms of the nationalist Russian style. As people commented on the time, it looked a bit like a fortress. And indeed, that was probably the point. Because Iliodor had learned nothing from his adventures so far and continued to make trouble. When he insulted a local female singer, calling her a sexual pervert and a prostitute, Iliodor got into severe trouble with Stolypin himself. The singer her husband was a prominent member in the Tsaritsyn city council who was linked certainly to the central government in St. Petersburg and was therefore able to bring this scandal to the attention of someone like Stolypin. And now Stolypin begins, the Prime Minister of Russia gets involved in this case, trying to remove, or at least gets Iliodor punished in some way. And indeed, a fine, but just a fine, is placed on Iliodor by the consistory. So around him, this one extremely troublesome monk is drawing in vast political powers. So, in other words, Iliodor had learned that he could more or less get away with anything. Neither the Synod nor the Prime Minister of Russia himself had yet managed to effectively stop him or punish him. so when again he caused a controversy at the beginning of 1911, and the Synod ordered him to go to a monastic prison in Tula as a punishment, Iliodor felt free to ignore the punishment and instead fled to his new monastery fortress, gathering his supporters around him and locking the doors, preventing the police from carrying out the Synod's orders and escorting him to Tula. It took the bishop of Tsaritsyn, Gomegien's intervention to get Iliodor to back down. Iliodor initially agreed to go to Tula, but after a very short period of time, once again returned to Tsaritsyn, where he once again locked himself up in his monastery. The Synod was, unsurprisingly, infuriated by Iliodor's consistent disobedience and flouting of both church and state law, and tried to defrock him. However, Nicholas II intervened on Iliodor's behalf and prevented this punishment from occurring. The stress caused by this political situation was so severe that Metropolitan Antonii Vadkovskii had a stroke. And as a result of that stroke, died ultimately as a result of that stroke, died a year later. Iliodor's monastery complex continued to be a hive of illegal and illegitimate activity. 2 people were found dead in there, but yet the police were unable to enter, barred by Iliodor and his supporters. And yet still, Iliodor received sponsorship from the highest circles of Russian society, from the imperial family itself. Empress Alexandra sponsors a pilgrimage cruise down the river Volga, so that Iliodor and his supporters could go and worship at the grave of Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Although Iliodor was supposed to ask permission from his bishop to move around the country, he frequently flouted that requirement, using his contacts in the highest circles of Russian society to gain tickets to undertake illicit trips across the country. So, for instance, he went to Moscow to visit a man who had been imprisoned for stealing a miracle-working icon. Iliodor wanted the prisoner to reveal the location of the stolen icon, so that then he, Iliodor, would be able to create a huge pilgrimage celebration in honor of that icon. Finally, by the end of 1911, Iliodor went too far. He had lost the support of Grigorii Rasputin, more on whom in a moment, and thus lost the support of Empress Alexandra and Nicholas. As a consequence, the Synod was finally able to move against Iliodor, definitively and without question. They ordered him to a monastery prison in Vladimir diocese. This time he had no choice but to go. However, he kept on drawing crowds of worshippers of the faithful to him in his prison, where he often spoke to them from the prison window. And as such, the Synod pressured him into renouncing his Orthodox faith, which he did at the end of 1912, and as a consequence was finally removed from the Russian Orthodox priesthood. Now, this wasn't quite the end of the story of Iliodor Trufanov. He remained in Russia for a while, but became involved in an assassination attempt on Grigorii Rasputin. Following the failure of that assassination attempt, he fled to Finland. He ultimately ended up in the United States of America, where after an unsuccessful career of trying to write books and sell films on the story of Rasputin, ended up working as a janitor in a New York apartment flat, the career he held when he finally died. Now, the reason I bring up this story is a demonstration of how far, firstly, of the perversion of the Petrine church-state order under Nicholas II. That basically Nicholas II is interfering in truly nonsensical and difficult to justify ways into the church's own authority. By any measure, Iliodor Trufanov should have been thrown out of the church long before 1912. Priests had been thrown out for doing far, far less than Trufanov. But because Nicholas adamantly supported him, up until the point that Rasputin lost faith in Iliodor, the Synod was forced not only to allow Trufanov to remain in the church, but even to suspend the punishments that it itself issued against Trufanov. The church's authority in its own house is clearly in severe decline. That is what the Trufanov case is an example of. And this is even more so with the case of the far more famous figure I just mentioned, Grigorii Rasputin. So I'm sure everybody knows something or has heard something about Grigorii Rasputin. And I just want to go through here some parts of this story, but most pertinently, Rasputin's influence on church politics in this period. So basically, Rasputin was a fairly normal, in many senses, Russian peasant, who, after his marriage and having some children, decided to take a religious calling, to wander through Russia as a sort of holy fool or spiritual elder, visiting various monasteries and convents, visiting holy sites across Russia, occasionally going home to his village near Tobolsk, but generally sort of gaining a sort of reputation as a wise man. And certainly Rasputin did have a great deal of both physical and personal charisma. Most accounts always focus on the sort of the striking quality of his eyes, the almost hypnotic quality of his eyes. And he was able to rapidly gain supporters, not just among the people he met in monasteries and convents, but also in the higher echelons of the church and eventually Russian society. Now, to look beyond the personal and to look at the structural reasons for Rasputin's very improbable and extremely rapid rise to prominence, we need to look at two trends in the 19th century that we've seen in previous lectures. Firstly, there is the revival of this idea of spiritual elderhood, the idea of a wise, holy individual who lives a holy and pious life, being a guide, a giver of wisdom, a counselor in difficult times, a general instructor in leading a good, religious, holy life. Elders traditionally existed outside of the church's hierarchy. although the Synod certainly tried to promote the cults of elders who did exist within the hierarchy, traditionally they existed outside, which could of course give them a way of evading the authority of the Synod, and perhaps speaking even against the Synod. You can understand, given the Synod's fixation with its own religious authority, why it was skeptical of the sort of why it tried to domesticate elderhood by promoting bishops, by promoting the cults of bishops as hierarchs, as elders. But the influence of the revival of religious philosophy at the end of the 19th century had made elderhood extremely popular, not just among the people, but even in the fashionable circles of St. Petersburg, Moscow, essentially in the highest strata of Russian educated society. And secondly, there was the impact of Slavophilism, Slavophile views on the person of Nicholas II himself. Nicholas II took the views of the Slavophiles, the idea that the Slavophiles had argued that the nobility and other classes in Russia had been corrupted by the European culture brought in by Peter the Great, and that the Russian peasantry were the truly national, the truly pious people of Russia, the real representatives of the Russian nation. And that's how precisely Nicholas II regarded Rasputin, as we're going to see in a second. Now basically, I'm not going to go into the full details of how Rasputin makes his way into the circles of the imperial court. Basically, he makes acquaintances, particularly in Kazan. He meets people like Iliodor Trufanov. He's introduced into various circles in St. Petersburg, and then introduced into, finally, to the imperial family itself. So why did Rasputin win the trust and admiration of Emperor Nicholas and Empress Alexandra? Well, I think we can identify three reasons why. Firstly, there was the personality of Alexandra and her position in Russia. We should remember that she was not Russian. She was a Danish princess who had been married to the heir of the Russian throne. While she and Nicholas certainly had a very close and loving relationship, she had very few connections with Russian high society, very few close friends. And this was a situation only made worse by the fact that she was regarded as being a cold, imperious, aggressive woman who often pushed people away rather than drawing them in. As such, she relied very, very much, very heavily on those few close personal friends she had in Russian society. And so when Rasputin won her trust, she was extremely reluctant to abandon him or let him go. Then there were the views of Nicholas II, as I've just illustrated to you in the previous slide. Nicholas II, as a Russian nationalist, took a very Slavophile view of Rasputin. As a peasant, he thought, Rasputin was a pure, uncorrupted icon of the Russian people and could give Nicholas II a pure and uncorrupted view on how Russian society really worked. A view unsullied by ambition, by court intrigue, by westernized perspectives, and so on and so forth. So Nicholas II essentially regarded Rasputin and valued him as a peasant truth speaker, someone who gave him a real view on Russia. And thirdly, of course, and perhaps most famously, there was the condition of Alexandra and Nicholas's son, Alexei, who was a hemophiliac. In other words, once he started to bleed, the bleeding would not clot of its own accord, which meant that even the slightest injury could be life-threatening for the heir to the Russian throne. Now, certainly some doctors, the court doctors of the time, alleged that Rasputin had a quasi-miraculous influence on Alexei. How true that is, it's very hard to really say, given 120 years up between us and the difference between medical knowledge then and medical knowledge now. But what is certain is that in these crises for Alexandra and Nicholas, in these moments when their son seemed to be on the edge of death, Rasputin's presence calmed them down significantly, gave them spiritual peace of mind, allowed them to escape from the worry and anxiety over their injured son and to move forward. And they absolutely valued him for this role that he played in their family life. Now, Rasputin's rise to prominence and to the trust of the imperial family already began to be noticed in around 1909, when whispers around the court about this semi-literate peasant elder from the countryside began to enter into the newspapers. Certainly, it is no doubt to my mind, the reason for these intrigues was these aristocratic courtiers were no doubt jealous that a peasant had gained such easy and quick access to Nicholas II and the imperial family, while they themselves were often left on the outskirts. The newspaper stories about Rasputin became ever more scandalous, increasingly alleging an illegitimate relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin. This caused ever more worry to the supporters of the Tsar, including members of his own family, who begged Nicholas to distance himself from Rasputin. However, Nicholas II always refused, claiming that his personal life was of no concern either to his courtiers or the rest of Russian society at large. Here we have a weakness of Nicholas II's personality and intellectual capacities. Nicholas II should have realized that as the self-proclaimed absolute ruler of Russia, of course, his social life, his personal life, had political consequences, and that his personality had to be guarded against such scandals. But nonetheless, Nicholas II stuck by Rasputin. And the stories in the papers and the journals and the rumors going around the salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow and elsewhere, and even eventually abroad, became ever more and more lurid, alleging, for instance, that Rasputin was a chlist, a flagellant, that is to say, someone who whipped himself to drive to enter into both religious and erotic ecstasy. And by the beginning of the Second World War, the pressure being put on both Rasputin and the imperial family was immense. There was scarcely a day when some story about Rasputin was not printed in the newspapers. Now this brings us to try and have just a brief few comments on the difference between the myth of Rasputin and the reality of Rasputin. I don't want to go on too long because this isn't the subject of this talk, or indeed this course, but it's worth commenting anyway. Much of what we know about Rasputin comes from a book written by no one other than our favourite mad monk, Iliodor Trufanov. And if you remember, Iliodor Trufanov truly hated Rasputin. He blamed Rasputin for the loss of the emperor's support, which had essentially cost him his position in Tsaritsyn and led him and lost him his position in the church. Trufanov was involved, hated him so much, he was involved in at least one assassination attempt against Rasputin. So it is hardly surprising that the book written about Rasputin, which was the first and major book about Rasputin translated into English, therefore gaining a large international audience, was hardly unbiased in its treatment of Rasputin. Indeed, it's very easy to show that virtually everything in Trufanov's book is a lie, a manipulation, or a mistruth. Our other sources that were commonly known until recently also don't do much to show us the reality of Rasputin. Newspaper reports consciously trying to generate scandal in order to sell newspapers. A couple of doctored police reports, doctored by Rasputin's political enemies precisely to try and persuade the Tsar to remove him. And finally, another book written by Rasputin's eventual murderer, Prince Yusupov, and in his book where Yusupov basically describes Rasputin as a sort of demonic presence in Russia. Of course, the reason Yusupov describes Rasputin as a demon is because it makes his murder of him seem less severe and more justified. These are the basic sources of the Rasputin myth as we've come to know it today. However, the reality, which has been recently published in an excellent book by Douglas Smith, I recommend you to read it, is much more mundane. Rasputin was neither a devil nor an angel, neither a holy saint nor a dark demon. Firstly, it's disputable how much influence he ever had over Nicholas. We know there are multiple occasions, and it can be shown on multiple occasions, that Nicholas ignored the advice of Rasputin on many key and crucial issues. One of which is worth mentioning is Rasputin didn't want Russia to go to war in 1914. Nicholas, of course, ignored that particular piece of advice. The Church conducted 2 separate investigations of Rasputin to see if there was any evidence whether he was a Klist, a flagellant, a sectarian. And on both occasions, despite having every reason to find negative things about Rasputin, the Church reported that Rasputin's behaviors were entirely orthodox. Now, Rasputin said he was not an angel. He absolutely did engage in questionable and immoral behaviors. He certainly molested women at virtually any opportunity he was given, and certainly did visit prostitutes. As the pressure from scandals increased on him, he absolutely did turn to vodka as a way of relieving this pressure. This was particularly the case after the first failed assassination almost killed him. He increasingly turned to vodka as a way of physical and mental support. And it should be noted, Rasputin never himself, as far as we know, ever claimed to be a holy man. He never claimed to be a miraculous healer. He never claimed that he miraculously healed Alexei. He wasn't particularly interested as an individual in proclamating his own reputation. And finally, it is worth mentioning that he did have some favourable qualities that recommend him to a more modern audience. He was an anti-Semite. He was not an anti-Semite, for instance. Indeed, on some writings stood very much in defence of the Jews. This was remarkable given, as we've seen earlier in this lecture, many of the hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church were actively joining and sponsoring anti-Semitic political institutions. he certainly had an element of pacifism in his views. As I mentioned, he advised Nicholas not to go to war in 1914 and in several occasions prior to that. And finally, he doesn't seem to have sought particularly financial gain from his activities. He was extraordinarily generous with the money that he was given, and the only reason he ever charged money was so that he could support the various charitable initiatives he was involved in. So Rasputin, in other words, was a fairly normal person in terms of his moral qualities. He, as I said, he was not black or white, neither demon nor angel, but rather a rather flawed, sinful human being who had happened to be propelled through his personal charisma and happenstance into a position of considerable political, social, and cultural power. But there is one area where Rasputin did exercise an influence on Nicholas II, and that was in church politics. And there are at least two cases I can go into here where we see Rasputin's influence very clearly. So the first was the case of promoting a new Metropolitan of Moscow. Vladimir Bogoyavlensky, the Metropolitan of Moscow in 1912, was removed from his position because, most likely, of his personal antipathy towards Rasputin. This was unprecedented. It was the first time in imperial history the Metropolitan of Moscow had been demoted from his position. Then the question, of course, was who would replace Vladimir at the Metropolitan. It was widely expected that Antoni Krapavitsky, the Bishop of Volhynia in modern Ukraine, sorry, I beg your pardon, in Eastern Poland, I beg your pardon, in Eastern Poland, was widely believed to be the outstanding candidate. He was highly conservative, an extreme Russian nationalist and anti-Semitic. Although it has to be said, he had long been a supporter of church reform as well, for instance, a long supporter of restoring the Patriarchate. However, again, it was widely known that Antoni Krapavitsky detested Rasputin. And as a consequence, Antoni was not promoted, even though he had already printed and sent out thank you cards to congratulations that he'd received. Instead of Antoni, one of the most prominent churchmen of the time, Nicholas promoted the 77-year-old Bishop of Tomsk, Makarinievsky, to be the Metropolitan of Moscow. Now, in his youth, Makary had been an extremely successful missionary in the Altai, but he was now at this point rather old, rather fragile, rather frail, and he was pretty much a nobody in the church. He wasn't regarded as a great preacher, a great thinker by anybody. And so this was a humiliating shock to both Antoni Krapavitsky and Vladimir Bogoyavlensky, two of the most prominent and influential Russian bishops in the church. The second, and in many ways the defining area where Rasputin had influence on church politics was the canonization controversy in the city of Tobolsk, from where Rasputin himself was from originally. Well, he was from a village near Tobolsk, but yes, okay. What happened was, in 1911, Rasputin used his influence to get his close friend and associate Vanava promoted to be the Bishop of Tobolsk. The problem with Vanava, as far as the Russian Orthodox episcopate and church was concerned was he was a semi-literate gardener monk who had held virtually no positions of authority before being granted this position. In other words, the only reason he got this job was because he was Rasputin's friend. Now remember a few lectures back when I talked about one of the defining qualities, characteristics of the Russian episcopate in this period is their high level of education. And this highly educated group has just been forced by Rasputin to accept a person who was barely literate as a bishop. It was regarded as humiliation. And the humiliation only carried on with Vanava's actions in Tobolsk. Now, for the previous few decades, Tobolsk had been the site of attempts to promote a local deceased churchman, Metropolitan Ioan, as a saint. Ioan had been a crucial bishop for Tobolsk at the end of the 17th, early 18th century. And the local clergy in Tobolsk had long tried to push the Synod to canonize him. As we noted much earlier in this course, the Synod was extremely reluctant to conduct canonizations in this period, especially when there was heavy support from local clergy, because they were always suspicious that the local clergy were trying to promote a local saint for financial reasons. And so they had refused consistently the attempts to turn Metropolitan Ioan into a saint. In 1915, however, Vanava ignored the Synod's consistent policy regarding this canonization and basically started treating Ioan like a saint anyway, even conducting the necessary ceremonies in the Cathedral of Tobolsk. The Synod and the Procurator were furious at this disobedience on the part of Vanava, of this deliberate flouting of their decades-old policy, and so started to make moves to removing Vanava from his position. And here, Rasputin spoke with Nicholas II in favor of his friend, and Nicholas II stopped the removal process. Not only did he stop the removal process, he made the Synod legitimate Vanava's actions. A year or so later, Metropolitan Ioan of Tobolsk was turned into a saint by the Synod. In other words, Rasputin's influence had led to humiliation of the Synod and humiliation of synodal policy. Furthermore, it should also be noted is as a consequence of this scandal, the Procurator was fired from his position. So what does this case show? We see a person with a reputation of being a holy elder, someone outside the hierarchy of the church, is able to exploit cultural and social trends that the Orthodox Church itself had somewhat promoted, to ascend to a position of extreme influence in the Russian imperial court, to gain the ear of Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. The Synod had no control over Rasputin. He wasn't a priest or a monk. He didn't have to listen to their dictates. And because of the extremely close relationship of church and state in Imperial Russia, Rasputin, through Nicholas II, was able to exercise an entirely deleterious, disadvantageous, humiliating and destructive policy on the Russian Orthodox Church, repeatedly undermining the authority of the Synod and the reputations of key members of the clergy. Iliodor, Trufanov, and Grigorii Rasputin mark the final perversion of the Petrine church-state relationship, its transformation into an absurd farce that made a ridicule, that made the church a ridiculous institution. And the consequence was, as we're going to see in the next lecture, was that the church was entirely alienated from Nicholas II, and when February 1917 came, did nothing to save the Tsar or the Romanov monarchy. So thank you for your attention. I'm sure that this was a very long one, but I hope it was productive. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Okay, goodbye.